Yes, we would like to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. We are very excited to be co-hosting this presentation today. We here are the technical assistants to Brownfield provider with WVU. So that's myself, Katie. I'm the Brownfields redevelopment specialist here, along with Becca, and our director is Carrie Staten. And so as a tab provider, as you can see on the map provided here, there are multiple EPA regions around the country, and we are the provider for Region 3. So all the assistance that we provide is at no cost to any of the communities. So the EPA, we work with the EPA to help determine the best ways to help get information out to you, to let you know about types of EPA brownfield grant funding, how to apply for them, tips and tricks, education, all the things to help make your community successful in order to turn around brownfields into some thriving sites. So next slide, please. Thank you. So there are kind of four main components of what we provide as the tab provider. That would be education. So that's the reason you're here today. The Ayres and Associates, they are going to show you a bit about what you can do with the assessment grant. So it's a bit beyond what you would think about with just traditional assessment grant funding. So again, this today is an example of the education piece that you can see about that. We provide some one-on-one consultations. So again, if that is, hey, I want to apply for a brownfield grant, how do I go about doing that? We can provide assistance with that. We can also help you once you get your grant. The implementation processes can be a bit daunting, so we can help with that too. Also, we do have on our team as part of our services, that would be design and visioning. So, you know, once you've received a grant and you're learning about the tools and tricks that you can use today, tricks is probably not the best word, but tools that you can do with your assessment grant funding. We have the ability with our partner here at WVU to help you go through the visioning process with your community and come up with some plans and renderings to help bring your goal and your vision for your community to life. And public health impacts, that's information we can provide to you as well. We also have another great asset on our team who can provide that data. That's an important piece with your grant application funding and how to apply that and how to hopefully improve that for your community. And also when it comes to funding sources. So not only do you need to try, or might you need to get some grant funding to help turn your community around and redevelop those brownfield sites, but funding for after you have assessed and cleaned up the site. We can work to help you identify such funding as well. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our team here with Ayres Associates. So we have with us Matt, Keely, and Christina, and I will let them introduce themselves. Again, thank you all for joining us. We're really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Katie and Becca, for the welcome and introduction. And we're excited to be here as well, providing our first webinar with you all on how to really leverage beyond the brownfield and think about planning for assessment grant success with activities that extend beyond the phase 1, phase 2 environmental studies that most of us are pretty well familiar with. My name's Matt Ashby, and I'm the Vice President for Development Services for Ayres. And this is a purpose-built group of folks that include community planners, landscape architects, environmental scientists, as well as economic developers that really bring together the full spectrum of services that we need to move projects from brownfields to beyond the brownfield and redevelopment. So I'll turn it over to Keely Campbell to introduce herself.
Thank you, Matt. As he said, my name is Keely Campbell. I'm based in Madison, Wisconsin. My technical background is geology. I started with Ayres in 2016 as an environmental scientist, working on a lot of brownfield projects. But I kind of opened my eyes to really the power of brownfield grants and brownfield programs in local communities and what they could do through some of the activities we'll talk about today.
And also on our team, we have Christina Hegel. Christina.
Hi, yeah, I'm Christina Hegel, and my technical background is I'm an environmental engineer. I've been working on oil and gas and large brownfield sites from sugar plants to manufacturing plants for over 20 years. And I'm our Western Division Manager, and have really enjoyed working on these collaborative projects and learning what we can do from start to finish for redeveloping blighted properties across the U.S.
Fantastic. And a little bit more about me. I've actually been on the public sector side, implementing brownfield grants for a small city out west, and have written a number of grants. So understand what it's like to actually run a grant project and pull together all of the resources that are necessary. And we've seen the power of the EPA Brownfield program and are excited to share some of the ideas of how you can make these grants even more effective in impacting your communities. So want to do a little bit more polling, and we're switching from the Zoom account polling to a poll everywhere system. So if you want to take out your smartphone and go ahead and scan that QR code with the camera on your phone, or if you're on a laptop or want to, you can type in the address pollev.com /Matt Ashby 167 to be able to pull open a browser that will allow you to engage with the voting as it's happening. So we'll give that just one more minute here for folks to be able to get that pulled up. And you don't have to sign your name into this if you don't want to, but we're just curious to see a little bit of interaction from folks on where you're from and what you're interested in as far as brownfields go. So we'll go ahead and move on here. If I could ask either Becca or Katie to add that URL to the chat box, that will allow people to log in that way even after this slide is gone. Thanks so much. So we're interested in hearing where folks are from. We've got a couple of folks out west, looks like Wisconsin and maybe Louisiana, Texas, West Virginia. It gets a little bit tough to see where folks are from some of the East Coast states where the geography is smaller. I know even trying to punch it in on your phone, that screen is pretty small. But it looks like we've got a good representation from across the country. And certainly that's an important thing because we can learn from everybody who has different experiences. So next question for you, just to give us a sense of who you are and where you're at. We're interested in finding out where you are on your brownfield journey. So are you in the process of writing a new grant this year? Do you have a new grant in place that's already been awarded and are just getting started? Are you launching your inventory process? Are you working to complete ESAs and other public engagement? Or are you looking to move projects forward into redevelopment? So more of that advanced opportunity. Very good. Looks like we've got a few newbies here, which is awesome. This webinar is definitely for you. We've got some suggestions on things that you might be able to include and incorporate into your grant. But for those of you that already have grants, certainly these activities might be ways for you to structure your public engagement and outreach and provide activities that will make your grant more robust. So obviously the goal of the Brownfield program is to eliminate barriers to redevelopment. And looking for ideas to spend your assessment grant beyond just those environmental studies is really an important way to leverage your ability to impact your communities through this program. And very specifically, I think what we as practitioners have found is that because those environmental studies have a time frame window that they expire in, the lasting power of those ESAs, sometimes ticks and runs out. And so by having a good balance of both environmental studies and other planning work or visioning exercises, you're able to really provide your community with a vision to move forward that hopefully sets that momentum in motion. So in looking at a typical brownfield project, you'll have a launch process where you're really looking at that site inventory and developing the overall plan for your grant implementation. You'll be engaging the community with a steering committee and a public engagement outreach plan and really working to generate that local buy-in. Planning comes in as area planning is one of the important components of brownfield grants and assessment grants, where you'll start to develop plans for the vision, land use plans, redevelopment plans, but also funding strategies for how to move forward with a redevelopment project. The assessments will come in as far as phase 1 and phase 2 and those alternative cleanup alternatives. And then looking at the re-envisioning process of workshops where you can start to explore what that new future for those brownfield sites might be. And those can certainly include 2 and 3D sketches, visual renderings, videos that actually walk people through some of that redevelopment, or even packets that highlight properties that are available for investment. And really the idea there is to use all of these steps to move forward and develop momentum to hopefully seek additional funding that might be used for cleanup or to pursue investment and keep that revitalization life cycle moving forward. So some of the community engagement options that we'll highlight throughout this process include things like social media stations, getting people excited online and sharing their ideas, touring local or regional projects to get an idea from people who have actually implemented solutions, what they did, and actually see their projects in action. The bottom left is integration of artistic components. So why I love this place chalkboards, or we've seen silk screening done to get people actively engaged in describing their vision for the future. Food trucks are always great at public meetings. Brew fests are fun to be able to link up a brownfield activity with a brew fest to maybe capture a group of people that might not normally be involved in public meetings, and then district visioning to help in looking at that redevelopment vision for an area. So we're going to dive into just a couple of examples from around the country and some of the ways that the assessment grants were used beyond just those environmental studies. So the West Edge redevelopment in Cheyenne, Wyoming was how I got started in the brownfield process. It was a neighborhood-wide assessment that really started to look at ways to address flood concerns by taking brownfields and converting them into flood mitigation areas and parkland. And so one of those features that you'll see here was the Civic Commons Park that previously was a parking lot and surface lot that was underutilized. There's actually a parking structure just a block over. And so this area was redeveloped into a detention pond slash civic space. And the assessment grant process was used to identify some of the initial flood mitigation opportunities, as well as the redevelopment potential around this site, of which at least 4 properties immediately adjacent to this Civic Commons Park have already redeveloped. So using it as a catalyst, one of the things that we actually did was created an event called EdgeFest, which was a neighborhood celebration. It's now in its 8th year, attracted over 5,000 people last year. The cool thing was that it was actually the first EdgeFest was an EPA Brownfield public meeting. So integrating live music into your events can really be a great way to bring people out to your meetings. So the next project that we'll highlight is the West Side Brownfield event in Laramie, Wyoming. Branding was an important part of this process to help create a neighborhood brand to really unify the group. We did have a pretty engaging public meeting that included food trucks, live music. This is one where we use the silk screening technique to create this opportunity for people to be actively engaged in talking about what their neighborhood vision would be. And so we created these signs. Folks were able to fill them out and say what they wanted as their hopes and dreams for the future of the neighborhood. And so having that active involvement is really important to getting people excited about this redevelopment process. So in addition, we did the requisite number of environmental studies, but these visioning pieces were the things that really got people excited and interested in investing in the neighborhood. We'll move to one more before I hand it over to Keely. This is the Douglas Double Down Initiative, and I did notice that there were a number of folks from the West Virginia area. Douglas is also a coal community where they are basically dealing with the transition from coal as a primary driver of their economy and looking to try and transition and shift to new opportunities. And this project really focused on a property that is a gateway to the downtown and looking at the opportunities for developing it into a conference center with hotels and convention center space, also residential and additional business opportunities for retail. One important collaboration to note is that this property is across the street from the State Fairgrounds site. And so there was a lot of collaboration on the economic viability of creating a conference and convention center in conjunction with that state facility. So lots of visioning, renderings, site planning was involved in this process. Also economic development pro formas of how many hotels could be supported on this brownfield site. Additionally, one of the other interesting things that happened in Douglas, they actually have a building that is, the shell is the only thing that is still standing. The rest of it was damaged by a fire. And so this historic facade is an important part of their downtown fabric, but it's just the front wall of the building. And so in order to redevelop this brownfield site, we were able to complete a structural assessment of this property to be able to identify how you would redevelop it and fit a new building into that site without impacting the adjacent building walls or losing that historic front facade. So definitely another way to incorporate assessment dollars in a pretty non-traditional brownfield assessment way. We've actually used this tool to do structural assessments a couple of times. In another case that we did, the question was, if we had to demolish this building, we need to know if we're demoing it or if we're trying to save it based off of the structural integrity to understand how the cleanup efforts would proceed. And so that was kind of that linkage to the brownfield land. And I'll go ahead and shift it over to Keely.
Matt. So next we are going to move a little bit southeast to Palatka, Florida. Palatka is a small historic town of about 10,000 people along the St. Johns River. If you're familiar with Florida, it's in the northern part of the state, about an hour from Jacksonville. The city was awarded 2 EPA assessment grants, one in 2015 and another in 2019. For their first grant, they really started pretty much from scratch. So they did take on those traditional brownfield site inventory and phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments to get them going. But really, what really got them started thinking beyond the brownfield was actually when they were hit with Hurricane Irma in 2017. I'm not sure if the statistic still stands, but at the time it was the most expensive storm in the history of the state. So really set people back. Now, we talked before, the Brownfield program is really about eliminating barriers to redevelopment. And at that time, the largest barrier was certainly the local stormwater infrastructure. No redevelopment, no revitalization was going to be able to happen until they were able to update that around those brownfield sites so that they could set those up for success. So that project team, in really fantastic communication with local stakeholders, the city and the EPA, received approval first to do an infrastructure analysis and some design concepts that would ultimately help them leverage funding to update their local stormwater systems in target brownfield areas. So again, those eventual redevelopments could succeed. Additionally, they focused in on a train depot as one of their catalyst brownfield sites that they wanted to redevelop as a multimodal hub. So Palatka, had potential to be a very pedestrian-friendly community, but they just weren't there yet, and they thought that was a good opportunity to kind of start them down that road. So that underutilized site would ultimately receive multiple analyses throughout those 2 grants, including 2D and 3D site redevelopment concepts and animations that, in addition to help kind of moving those redevelopments forward, it helped the community and other stakeholders really understand and envision how that site could be transformed, both to mitigate environmental impacts associated with it, but also, again, accommodating additional safe transportation modes in the city. They also had a large historic site along the river that you can see in red there. It had been long vacant, and it was called the Cypress Mills site. You'll see in the photos on the right here, following the initial phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments, the project team was able to develop both a land use concept for that site and the surrounding area, so that the brownfield itself, it's not existing in a bubble, it's really fitting in with the community around it. And we also were able to go through some branding exercises for the redevelopment to help generate excitement and kind of a new identity that both, again, shows people what it could be, but really honors that history of a site that's been there a long time. The city was ultimately able to leverage over $15 million in additional funding by using this kind of expanded approach to implementation of their brownfield grant. And I will send it back to you, Matt.
Okay, sounds good. So one thing, we do have a couple of videos on this one. Unfortunately, I don't have the 3D rendering and walkthrough, so we may send that out via link later on in the presentation. But we did have an engaging public outreach process, including a tactical urbanism workshop where we started to look at some of those complete streets issues with their main street. They have a number of properties along that street that are brownfields and are looking for redevelopment. And one of the signature items that they identified as a need to redevelopment was bringing people together and creating a new pedestrian-friendly, bike-friendly streetscape that would allow for that redevelopment to happen. So this was actually a public meeting that happened during the brownfield process, and some of the results that were actual brownfield deliverables. So if your community is looking at a streetscape program and a project in the future, brownfield dollars might be able to help get you jump started on that design process. Additionally, shifting gears now to City of Craig in Western Colorado. The package that they have worked on developing is really targeted towards developers and businesses that are interested in redeveloping sites. So in addition to all of the information that is being produced under the Brownfield grant, we're actually looking at packaging these into redevelopment reports that have all of the information that a developer would need to start the process of moving forward with their plans. So summary of the phase 1 and phase 2 ESAs, concept drawings like the ones that you're seeing here on the screen, pro formas for economics, in this case specifically, kind of bringing in that business side of things. The recommendation was currently this space is all one large restaurant. And the idea with the rendering was to look at options to split it into potentially 2 retail sites, just because having 6,000 square feet of retail to lease can oftentimes be a heavy lift for a Main Street business. So splitting it into 2 smaller spaces was recommended as a path forward. But looking at the construction costs based on information from the local building official, providing that remediation and facade visuals, as well as rental rates, helped link this property with the urban renewal tax increment financing that's necessary to help move forward with that investment. So really looking at, rather than creating a bunch of separate reports or studies, trying to package those together so that you're able to provide those to developers or business owners is another great tool to be able to use for the assessment grants.
Hey, Matt, and we did have a question come up in the chat. Joel asked, are these sites all publicly owned, or could you do this for a privately owned site? Just wondering if there's a conflict of interest there, depending on private versus public ownership.
Yeah, great question. The majority of the sites I would say are privately owned, which certainly is, you know, the general direction that we see from brownfield investments. However, that Civic Commons parking lot in Cheyenne was city owned. The key thing is that you may need to use a partner, coalition partner, to be able to complete that work. Or you need to provide that the city or public entity was not responsible for contamination. So there are ways that you can make sure that it is an allowed expense. But great question. I would say don't rule anything out at this stage. EPA is great to work with, and they can help you find a way to hopefully make those funds work for the properties that you have. All right, and my sound earbud just died, so I'm hoping everybody can still hear me okay. Fantastic.
I can hear you great.
So we'll go ahead and shift gears to the Lamar Prairie Crossroads Initiative, and over to Keely.
Thanks, Matt. And I'll quickly tag on a couple comments on benefiting privately or publicly owned sites. One way to really ensure that you don't kind of have that conflict of interest is to create a brownfield steering committee. So you don't have a singular person or entity that's making those decisions throughout your grant. You have multiple stakeholders that can really truly represent the needs and the wants of the community or organization that's receiving the grant. Additionally, if you have a publicly owned site, there are some things to watch out for there. Say it's a landfill is one that we hear a lot. Now, if a city or a town owned and operated that landfill throughout its life, you actually likely wouldn't be able to use that in your grant because you, the grant recipient, were the potential causer of any impacts that may be present at that site. So just something to be aware of on that end. So again, sticking in Colorado, we will discuss Lamar next. Lamar is located in eastern Colorado, pretty far from the Denver and any other metro area. With a population of around 7,800 people, this community was looking for ways to catalyze redevelopment and economic development that fit their unique local character and really that could be supported in the long term as a relatively small and kind of more remote community in Colorado. Lamar, again, also took on that traditional site inventory and environmental site assessment activities. But to really help move the ball forward throughout their grant period, they focused in on a few catalyst sites that they had great redevelopment potential. One was the Troy Motel, one was the Main Cafe, which actually was a city-owned site. And another local site that you'll see on the right here that was a Quiznos sandwich shop that had a large amount of underutilized space in the structure on site. So to the right, you will see a few versions of redevelopment concepts that were developed, again, with robust community engagement. The project team engaged both community planners and landscape architects to inform these designs. But at the top right there, you'll see a 2D site sketch that kind of shows different activations across the Brownfield site. A 3D still on the bottom that's actually from an animation that was created with the redevelopment concept of the whole site. And on the top left, it is a close-up of the building showing an artistic rendering of the building's garage door. So throughout Lamar's assessment grant, they were able to engage this site owner to discuss really reactivating the remainder of that building, which at the time they were using for kind of personal storage space. And what they thought might work there is a local brewery. You know, people were kind of looking for a place for dinner that they could bring their families, that, you know, maybe you could have a beverage of choice, again, with both active indoor and outdoor options. So in addition to these visual redevelopment concepts, the project economic development professionals were also able to do some financial assessments, again, like Matt mentioned in Craig, to kind of inform the business side of things. So they developed pro forma so that the city and the property owner could determine really the feasibility of the redevelopment of this site as a brewery. You know, it fit in with what the community wanted. It seemed like a good idea, but, you know, does this really make good business sense? And were we going to be able to actually feasibly do this? But it also helps narrow down maybe which breweries, of which there are many in Colorado, might be a good fit for the site. You know, Budweiser, probably going to be a little bit small for their needs, but, you know, if there was a relatively local brewery that was looking for some additional space in a tap room, you know, that pro forma would help say, hey, you're the ones for us. So one last exercise that the city undertook that I want to talk about to really take things beyond the brownfield was developing resource roadmaps for each of the catalyst sites that they focused in on. The purpose of those is really so that any of the momentum that you're generating with environmental, design, engagement, and planning activities can be continued long after that EPA Brownfield Assessment Grant closes out. So that could be for things like facade improvements, it could be for parking lot improvements, a number of things that you can receive funding for either through grants, private investments, or other financial opportunities. Lamar was actually awarded a second EPA assessment grant this last cycle, and they are just starting to implement that. Back to you, Matt.
Very good. Thanks, Keely. And definitely having those visuals is an important way to attract investment and really communicate an idea. As Keely had mentioned, the rear of that property was just being used for personal storage. And, you know, the owner was not real excited about a whole lot of different other things, but once he saw the visuals, he was able to kind of buy into that concept. And unfortunately, the idea was launched to him in, I think it was February of 2020. And so the investment atmosphere changed considerably. And so we're hoping that through this next round of assessment grants, we'll be able to re-engage with that owner and maybe move that redevelopment project forward. So then I think, Keely, we're going to start tag teaming on this. So we've got a number of those different opportunities that we presented to you all as far as innovative tools. But really looking at how you start to work these types of activities into your grant applications is really an important component. You don't have to necessarily detail exactly what you're planning to do, but making sure that you have a definition of the purpose of the activity, is important. So EPA wants to know if you're having a workshop, what are you trying to achieve? Are you looking to create a vision? Is it developer focused? Or, are you trying to activate the community? So really getting a good definition of that activity and then linking it to a redevelopment plan or a comprehensive plan is always a great strategy. Making sure that there is a justification that is explained as to, hey, we're going to have this redevelopment workshop. And why? Because our comprehensive plan says we should redevelop our downtown brownfield area. So being able to provide that justification is really important. We do suggest including this in your area-wide planning or public engagement tasks. So building it into that process. All of these activities could qualify under area-wide planning. And so when you're not sure what to call it, EPA understands the term area-wide planning, and you can say, yep, that's where it fits. Be sure to reference your cost table in your grant. So specifically in this application, area-wide planning was about $175,000 of the overall grant request. And this one in particular included a roundhouse tour for a redevelopment site that was in a neighboring community to be able to get folks into that redeveloped site and experience that brownfield. Several other public meetings were outlined within this area-wide planning effort as well. And Keely, do you want to talk a little bit about the balance of money from environmental and how it links with area-wide planning?
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to say that what we're talking about here is important both in that grant writing phase. So for a lot of you that have responded, you're writing a new grant this year. These are all things that you can incorporate into that application. And hopefully it'll help you kind of build up the meat on the bones of each of the tasks that you're identifying for the grant that you're submitting for. But it will also help in preparing those work plans if your grants are awarded once you start working with the EPA to get under contract with them. So yeah, like you can see here, I think a lot of people, myself included, when I started working on these grants, it's an EPA grant, Environmental Protection Agency. So that environmental work, I think, takes a lot of precedence in our mind. And a lot of people kind of approach these and say, okay, well, I'm going to use $300,000 to do phase 1s and phase 2s. And what I'm going to be left with at the end of the day is a stack of these environmental reports. And if that's truly what your community needs, then absolutely move forward with it. Those are eligible grant activities. But a different approach to that is shifting some of that environmental money into area-wide and site-specific redevelopment planning. Again, with the hopes of helping move those sites forward through the redevelopment process, and not just kind of sticking with those initial due diligence exercises. So if you read through the grant guidelines, there's a couple important things to pay attention to. One is the preferred split of using 40% of the grant funds on environmental. So again, that would include things like phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. That also includes working on your site eligibility determinations to get sites eligible into your EPA grant, as well as preparing your health and safety plans for phase 2s, your quality assurance documents that are required for the EPA. All of those things fit into that 40% environmental bundle. But they also prefer that you use 30% on area-wide planning activities. So with that 500,000 grant maximum that hopefully everyone's applying for the maximum amount of, you can use those metrics to help determine your cost table. So again, here, this one was working with $175,000 for area-wide planning, whatever the 40% of their environmental costs would be, and then kind of split the rest up between public engagement, programmatic costs for managing your grant that it's important to know is a grant eligible activity, as well as remediation planning. So, we talked a lot about redevelopment planning and revitalization planning. But remediation is also kind of part of those planning exercises. So if you do have a site after you're moving through the phase 1 and phase 2 exercises that needs to be remediated before it can be redeveloped, that kind of also can fit into the reuse planning stage.
Great, thanks, Keely. And one of the other key things of working these elements into your grants is kind of having an idea of what some of the costs are. So just to highlight that quickly, social media station, if it's integrated into one of your other public meetings, probably is a fairly low cost element. The idea there is that you have people sharing their vision for the future of a building on social media and getting people excited. So really minimal hard costs. In the example that we're showing here, we did create an Instagram photo frame for folks to be able to take their pictures in and then post it online. So kind of fun to do that. You do need somebody there that's managing the tech at the meetings to make sure you're pushing those images out and doing the right hashtags and all of that stuff. So a good rule of thumb to add a social media station is probably about $2,500. Over on the right, the food trucks, pulling a full food truck into a public meeting, those folks are running a business. And so they're going to likely need some guaranteed minimum ticket amount for them to show up and provide their food truck on a Tuesday night at your location. So good to be thinking about that and building in some time for coordination costs or also advertising costs. So good rule of thumb, several $1,000s. It really depends on your local food trucks and whether or not they'll come for a minimum amount of money. Additionally, local project tours are really a great way to get people out of their community and seeing what redevelopment can do in similar projects. I mentioned the roundhouse tour that we had proposed for one community. There was some distance, about 6 hours drive. So we did want to make sure to include costs for transportation, as well as identifying the number of participants. So can you all pile into a van and go see these sites, or is it like a city council or a planning commission that you want to join and you need a bus? So consider those transportation logistics. The other tip that we would have for you is to consider the social aspect of the event. If there's an opportunity to stop at a brewery and have that conversation informally with those groups of people, we often find that the mix of attendees is really great at generating ideas. So be sure to include that social time. The Brewfest meeting, we did show that the video on that included a tactical urbanism workshop. So we had to accumulate a few additional set items or prop items that we were demonstrating the streetscape design with. But the secret to that was tagging on to that larger Brewfest event. We were able to capture participation from a larger audience that probably might not have attended a public meeting on their own if it was a separate event. So really being able to use that as a piggyback was a positive thing. The art installation activity with the silk screen, that one is one of our cheaper items. We had about a $1,500 stipend that we paid the artist. Again, it's their livelihood, so we need to make sure to pay them for that. But it was definitely a great hands-on way to get people engaged in redevelopment planning. And then finally, the district visioning is again a little bit more expensive based on consultant participation, creation of scaled maps and building blocks that could be added to the map for people to start to create their own redeveloped neighborhood. Does require some advanced planning, mapping, and potentially is a multi-day event. So want to make sure that we're planning effectively for that. So if you would get your phones out again, we have another polling event. We're interested in finding out what engagement opportunities excite you the most. And just curious to see if any of these ideas jump out at you a little bit more than others, because it'll help us to kind of tailor some of the future events and assistance that might be provided. And certainly, we're getting close to the end of the Q&A section. And if folks do have questions about how any of these types of activities played out, we can definitely talk through that later in the process. So some good ideas. I'm seeing that tours are getting a lot of traction. We've actually provided for tours in a couple of the Brownfield grants. One was a tour of a redeveloped mine site to help the community envision what reuses could be. Another one was a visit to a redevelopment district in a larger community that was nearby to go ahead and see and talk with some of the visionaries behind that district. So definitely a great opportunity and an eligible expense under the Brownfield process. So with that, we are to Q&A, and I will go ahead and turn it over to Christina so that we can get some questions and comments and interaction with you all.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It looks like we do have some questions coming in the chat. Is it typically necessary for an entire site to require remediation redevelopment, or can a site preserve some existing use while preparing other areas for development? Good question. Keely or Matt, do you guys want to take that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, if you want to lead in, and I'll follow up.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, so you can definitely use the existing site and prepare other areas for redevelopment while you're working on the redevelopment property. Matt, do you have any examples of that? I was trying to think of a good example really quick here.
Yeah, you know, with a larger like rail yard district or something along those lines, you may have properties that are closer to transportation connections. You know, in the economic terms, we call it a hot corner, where it basically has more traffic visibility or things like that. So you definitely could prepare those more viable sites for redevelopment, which then gives you the time to start to work on the rest of the property, and it starts to get that vision moving.
Yeah, I was just thinking of some of the really big sites, like some of the big sugar factories and stuff, where they have, you know, we have just little pieces of the site being redeveloped at a time, just because it's too big of a fight to take massive sections of it. So
yeah, I actually would reference a grain elevator property here in Cheyenne, where the property actually had multiple buildings on it. And the owners started not with the landmark grain elevator, you know, that is the architectural landmark that everybody's so excited about, but with some of the other smaller buildings on the site. They converted one into a yoga studio, another into I think it was a cabinet maker space. And then finally, the last piece that they're looking at is the grain elevator to tackle that bigger project now that they've got some investment already in play.
Yeah, and I think this is relevant on small sites as well. You know, you have those big sites where you have a lot of room and, you know, maybe you're going to do a phased redevelopment or phased remediation. But when we were talking about the Lamar site, that one, for example, was, you know, a pretty standard sized commercial site, again, in a pretty small downtown. So that one, you know, it was in productive use with the Quiznos on the end of the building, but really we were looking to redevelop or reutilize the other end of that one specific building. I also think it's relevant for remediation. You know, as you go through those environmental exercises, you know, you do your phase 1, you start on the phase 2, and you realize that you need to move forward with additional assessment and remediation. Typically, you know, say the site was historically used as a gas station, you know, the impacts that you're looking at might really be limited to where the tanks were stored, or just another smaller space on a larger site. So, you know, you can have just one area of the site that you're looking to redevelop, but you can also have just one area of the site that you need to remediate.
So what other questions do we have? Several of you are working on grants. Do you guys have questions that that we can try to answer for you, either Becca or Katie or one of us from Ayres? Looks like Joel just asked, would luring the public to an event with catered food, not the dining, but the pizza, etc., be eligible? Yes, somewhat.
Fantastic question. Great way to put it. Essentially, with the food trucks that we did, we talked with EPA and identified that a certain portion of the meeting expenses would have been towards refreshments anyway. And so we provided a token system to essentially give participants an ability to have, you know, $3 off their order from the food truck. So it takes a little bit of working as far as figuring out how that is going to be okay with EPA. But talking with your project officer, more times than not, they're going to be excited to help you figure out how to navigate that system. Certainly, as consultants, we have also sponsored beverages. Now, that is one area where obviously the grant could not pay for a stop at a brewery. But certainly, as consultants, we have sponsored that type of event. Just from the sheer benefit that it provides to the overall project to have those conversations. So it is a little bit of a fine line, but definitely talking to your project officer is the way to start that conversation.
All right, any other questions for those of you that are writing grants? Do you have questions about you know, any eligible expenses or how to put it in or how to put specific information in to make your grant more, make your story a little bit better or help your story be a little bit more exciting to the EPA by bringing in some of those planning pieces?
We had one question previously, and thank you, Becca, for answering that in the chat, but so everyone can hear it. So Ben had asked if there was a benefit to grants that are either site-specific or community-wide. And previously, the EPA did offer site-specific grants for assessment, but now it's just they have a community-wide option and a statewide option. So for most people on this call, I would expect you're going to be looking at that community-wide assessment grant to implement these activities. So you're probably going to be looking at a few target sites, maybe a target district, so a little bit larger scale than just site-specific.
So there's another question here. What uses are prohibited on a former contaminated site? How do you remediate a toxic plume under a neighborhood where residents have a concerning higher incidence of cancer and other health impacts? Lloyd, that's a really good question. If it's a formerly contaminated site, it's going to be based on state and federal requirements. I've worked on a couple of sites that went under multiple neighborhoods or large amounts of neighborhoods where you're getting either vapor intrusion issues or concern for contamination into the drinking water, or where you might have some private wells in that area. So those big sites like that are usually managed under the state remediation programs. And it's going to take quite a bit of, you know, it's going to be state specific on how you clean that up. But as far as what uses are prohibited and what you can do, it depends on the level of contamination. So most states have an industrial or commercial or a residential use scenario that you can have based on the contamination levels. For example, and not to get into the technical crazy details, but basically they'll say, you know, if a child's exposed to this much level of contamination over over a lifetime, this would be their risk for cancer. And that's all based on toxicology results from lab studies. So anyway, long story short, it depends on the amount of contamination as to what the use can be and on the levels at that specific location. I know we're getting close to time. Katie and Becca, do you guys want to jump back in yet, or do you want to see if there's any more questions?
Happy to hear if there are any other questions. If not, I'll certainly wrap up and let folks know how we are available for any assistance.
Yeah, I guess just one closing comment that I would have. You know, Brownfield grants are phenomenal in what they can do. And to date, I've been amazed at EPA's willingness to say, is this issue or a barrier to redevelopment? And if you can prove that it is an activity that is related to stalling the redevelopment of that property or that area, the EPA is really likely to be able to work with you to try and find a way to make that happen. Specifically in a couple of the projects we've mentioned, community branding or district branding was one element that we used to really start to create an identity for an area and bring people together and create that momentum and excitement behind a project. And, you know, again, normally you wouldn't think that that level of graphic design would be something that would be able to be funded by EPA. Same thing with the structural building assessments. Gosh, I never would have thought that that would be an EPA eligible expense. But I think the moral of the story is you just never know until you start to ask. And if you have a good enough reason as to why that expense is needed, more often than not, I think EPA is going to work with you to try and make it happen.
All right, Matt, do you want to scroll to the last slide there? All right, well, thank you, everyone. And if you have any other questions, please get those to Katie, Becca, or Carrie, and they'll be happy to get those answers for you. And Katie, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, thank you all. Really want to thank Christina, Matt, and Keely. I know we internally have been looking forward to today's presentation, so we really appreciate your time, and I hope everyone has enjoyed this session. We just want to provide this contact information here to let you know how you can get in touch with us here. You can email us at wvutab@mail.wvu.edu. You can reach us through social media, sign up for our newsletter, and you can also schedule a one-on-one consultation with the link provided in this slide. Just want to remind you, of course, of the upcoming deadline for the EPA grants, and that is November 22nd. If we can be of any assistance in reviewing your draft applications, please reach out to us and let us know. If we do get it by today, we will turn them by November 10th. If we happen to get them by November 8th, we can turn them around by November 15th. Anything after November 8th, going to be a little bit hard to give a guarantee of when we can turn it around, just because we want to make sure you have enough opportunity to review our comments and incorporate that into your application moving forward. Again, those are immediate things that we can help you with, and there's so much more that we can help you with. And again, want to take the time to thank Ayres again. They've been a wonderful asset to our team here. So